What does it really take to achieve huge political change, national liberation, especially when a nation's fighting just to survive? It's a massive question.
It really is. And today, we're taking a deep dive into a text that gives a pretty unique angle on that exact problem. Mao Zedong's Problems of War and Strategy.
Right. Written in November 1938. So this isn't theory from an ivory tower, is it?
Not at all. It was hammered out right in the middle of China's incredibly tough war of resistance against Japan, a real strategic blueprint.
Okay, so our mission here is to pull out the key insights from this foundational work. How did Mao see military power, strategic flexibility? How were these viewed as just absolutely central to revolution, to survival in China's specific situation?
Exactly. And hopefully, as you listen, you'll get some of those aha moments, insights about power, strategy, adaptation, things that maybe resonate even outside of that specific history.
Sounds good. So where do we start? Mao begins with a kind of universal principle, doesn't he? Yeah.
He does. He kicks off by affirming the Marxist-Leninist idea that seizing political power through armed force, settling issues by war, is basically the highest form of revolution.
And he says that applies everywhere.
Universally, yes, that's the starting point. But then, almost immediately, he pivots.
Ah, okay, to how China was different.
Precisely. He highlights this major divergence in how that principle actually gets applied. He contrasts capitalist countries with China.
Right, so in capitalist countries, assuming they're not fascist or at war, there's maybe bourgeois democracy.
Yeah, and often these countries oppress other nations. So for the revolutionaries, the strategy is different there. You'd expect a long phase of legal struggle.
Using parliament, maybe. Strikes, trade unions.
Exactly that. Using parliament as a platform, organizing strikes, building unions, educating workers, all preparing for the eventual overthrow of capitalism. And crucially,
The target is the cities first.
right, seize the cities, then move out to the countryside. The October Revolution in Russia is the classic example he points to.
Okay, so a city first, kind of top-down model. But China in 1938.
A completely different picture. Mao describes it as semi-colonial and semi-feudal. Meaning it lacked real internal democracy. It was oppressed by feudal forces inside and imperialist powers from outside.
So no parliament to use as a platform. No real legal rights for organizing strikes.
Pretty much. So the Communist Party's task couldn't be this long legal buildup. And it definitely wasn't about grabbing the big cities first and hoping the countryside followed.
That really flips the script on the standard Marxist approach, doesn't it? What was it about China being semi-colonial, semi-feudal that forced this strategic rethink?
It demanded, well, basically the reverse strategy.
Yeah.
Mao categorizes their tasks. When there wasn't a major imperialist attack happening, the CCP might wage civil war with the bourgeoisie against regional warlords.
Like the Northern Expedition.
Exactly, or the Guangdong Wars earlier. Or they might fight against the landlord and comprador classes. Those are the Chinese elites tied to foreign interests alongside peasants and the urban petty bourgeoisie.
That was the Agrarian Revolution period, right?
Yeah.
1927 to 36.
That's the one. But then, in the context of 38, with Japan attacking...
It becomes a national war, uniting almost everyone against the foreign invader.
Right. And this underlines Mao's core point. In China, armed struggle isn't just one tool, it's the main form of struggle. And the army isn't just an organization, it's the main form of organization.
So other things like mass movements, protests, they're important, but secondary.
They're important, but they ultimately have to serve the war. He even quotes Stalin on this.
Oh, yeah. What did Stalin say?
Stalin apparently said, in China, the armed revolution is fighting the armed counter-revolution. That is one of the specific features and one of the advantages of the Chinese Revolution. Mao calls this perfectly correct.
Interesting. So what did this mean for the CCP's basic mission then, for their, reason for being?
It meant everything. Mao is blunt. Without armed struggle, the proletariat, the Communist Party, they have no standing at all in China.
Wow. No standing at all.
Their very existence, their ability to achieve anything revolutionary, it all came down to military power. Without guns, they were effectively powerless in that context.
And you mentioned they didn't grasp this initially. The CCP learned this the hard way.
Oh, absolutely. In their early years, say 1921 to 1926, he argues they really failed to grasp the supreme importance of armed struggle.
They focus more on mass movements.
Too much so, yes. And those movements just collapsed when the Kuomintang, their ally at the time, turned on them violently in 1927.
A brutal lesson.
Very. And even after 1927, Mao notes that many comrades were still fixated on urban uprisings, still trying to copy European models that just didn't fit China.
So when did the thinking really shift?
He points to the period after they fought off the nationalists' third major encirclement and suppression campaign around 1931. That's when, he says, a fundamental change started to take root, at least in parts of the leadership.
It really comes through in the text how much he believed China's problems cannot be settled without armed force. It wasn't just strategy, it felt existential.
Completely. That's why he's urging the entire party, every member, to pay great attention to war, study military matters, and prepare itself for fighting. It's about survival first, then revolution.
Okay, so understanding war is necessary. But you need an army. And Mao actually points to an unlikely teacher here, doesn't he? The Kuomintang.
Yeah, it's a fascinating twist. He essentially says the KMT taught the communists a vital lesson about power in China. He looks back at Sun Yat-sen, the KMT's founder.
Sun Yat-sen used armed struggle.
Consistently, according to Mao. From his very first revolutionary groups, like the Xingchenghui, through the 1911 revolution that overthrew the emperor, Sun recognized you needed military force.
And the Whampoa Military Academy, that was Sun's initiative too.
Yes, founded with Soviet help, actually. It trained a whole generation of officers, many of whom became key figures on both sides later. It showed Sun's commitment to building military power.
And then came Chiang Kai-shek. Mao says Chiang took KMT military power to its zenith.
That's Mao's assessment. He writes that Chiang valued the army as his very life and truly understood the equation. Whoever has an army has power, and that war decides everything.
It paints a picture of China as a place where military strength with political strength, almost directly.
Absolutely. Mao calls this a peculiarity of China. Unlike maybe some Western places, he argues, political parties without armies just didn't get very far.
He mentions warlords, right? And other parties.
Yeah, warlords like Tan Yankai, who always wanted military and civil control. And he contrasts them with parties like the Progressive Party or the Youth Party. They lacked military backing and, well, they mostly faded away.
The message seems clear. In China, guns equal power.
Yeah.
More guns, more power.
That's the reality Mao is describing.
Okay, so if that's the reality, how did Mao argue the communists should approach this? They needed an army, obviously, but how did they avoid just becoming another warlord faction? What was the difference?
That's the absolute core of his argument here. Yes, fight for military power, he says, but not for personal gain, not for individual power bases.
Who for then?
For the party, for the people, and crucially in 1938, for the nation in the fight against Japan.
And this leads to that really famous line.
Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Yes. But he immediately follows it with the crucial governing principle.
Which is?
Our principle is that the party commands the gun, and the gun must never be allowed to command the party.
That distinction is vital. The party stays in control. But how did they maintain that, practically speaking, with a growing army under constant pressure?
Well, Mao frames it through this idea of the omnipotence of war. He actually says it's good, not bad, it is Marxist.
How so?
Because, he argues, with guns, you can create things. You can create party organizations, train cadres, set up schools, foster culture, build mass movements.
So the gun isn't just for fighting.
No, it's foundational. He says everything in Yan'an has been created by having guns. All things grow out of the barrel of the gun. It's presented as a tool for societal construction, not just destruction.
That's such a stark paradox. Using the instrument of war to build peace or a new society.
And he takes it further. In order to get rid of the gun, it is necessary to take up the gun. War as the necessary path to abolish war itself. It's a radical reframing of conflict.
Okay, let's track the CCP's own military development then. It wasn't smooth sailing from the start.
Far from it. As we said, a real lack of understanding from 1921 to 24. But getting involved with the Whampoa Military Academy in 24 was a big step. Party members got military training, saw its importance.
We even led some units.
Yeah, like Yeting's independent regiment during the Northern Expedition, that was progress.
But then came 1927, the bitter lesson, as Mao calls it. The break with the KMT.
A huge setback, but also a catalyst. It led directly to the communists launching their own uprising. Nanchang, Autumn Harvest, Canton, and starting to build their own army, the Red Army. That was the crucial period where they finally committed to having their own military force.
And this process of learning and refining their military approach continued.
Definitely. A key moment Mao highlights is the Sunyi meeting during the Long March in 1935.
What happened there?
It represented a major shift in leadership and strategy. War became the absolute center of gravity. They consciously fought against what Mao saw as opportunism in military affairs, correcting both overly aggressive, adventurous tendencies and overly cautious, defensive ones.
So by 1938, where did Mao see the CCP standing militarily?
He felt they'd forged not just a solid Marxist political line, but also a solid Marxist military line. They were training cadres capable of leading in the party, in future state structures, and in the army.
He makes a point about their global position too, right?
Yeah, he notes that in his view, there were only three genuinely proletarian armies in the world then: the Soviet Union's, China's Red Army, and the forces fighting in the Spanish Civil War. It positions their struggle on a world stage.
Okay, so the gun is central, the party commands it, and they've built an army. Now let's get into the really interesting part, how they use that army. The strategy wasn't fixed, was it? It changed dramatically.
Sporadically. Mao outlines these strategic shifts very clearly. Let's look at the Civil War period first, before the full Japanese invasion.
Right. What was the strategy then?
He describes two main phases. Initially, it was primarily guerrilla warfare, small units, dispersed actions, relying on mobility and surprise.
And the second phase?
That evolved into what he calls a Chinese type of regular warfare. This wasn't quite conventional warfare as maybe practiced elsewhere. It involved concentrating forces for mobile battles, more centralization, but, and this is key, it still kept a strong guerrilla character.
So like guerrilla tactics scaled up.
You could say that. He calls it guerrilla warfare raised to a higher level.
Was this transition difficult? Were there arguments inside the party about it?
Oh, definitely. Mao details the struggles. They had to combat what he termed right tendencies, people stuck in purely local, small-scale guerrilla habits, resisting centralization.
And left tendencies too.
Yes, maybe even more damagingly. This involved things like over-centralization, reckless adventurism, and trying to rigidly copy foreign, specifically Soviet military doctrine without adapting it to China's unique conditions.
Did those left errors have consequences?
Mao says they led to enormous sacrifices during the Civil War period, huge losses, especially before the Sunyi meeting in 1935 managed to correct that line. It was a very painful learning process.
Okay, so that's the Civil War evolution. Then comes the War of Resistance against Japan, the situation in 1938. How did the strategy change again?
It flipped back, in a way. For this stage of the war, Mao states clearly, guerrilla warfare is primary.
Even with the Eighth Route Army operating as a more regular force.
Yes. Even with those larger formations undertaking dispersed operations, the overall strategic emphasis, the main effort, had to be guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines.
He does look ahead, though, right, to a future stage.
He does. He anticipates a future strategic counteroffensive. In that stage, he predicts regular warfare will be primary. That would mean more concentration, more organization, less guerrilla character, and needing up-to-date equipment.
But for 1938, it's back to guerrilla warfare. That shift happening in autumn 1937, when the war fully erupted, seems remarkable. Going from the higher-level regular warfare of the late Civil War back to primary guerrilla warfare, Mao calls it a step backward strategically. Why was that necessary?
Two main reasons. Me and the ally. The enemy, Japan, was vastly more powerful and technologically advanced than the KMT forces they'd fought previously. A head-on confrontation would be disastrous.
And the ally, the KMT.
The alliance with the KMT was complex, fragile. The CCP needed a strategy that allowed them to fight Japan effectively without being easily contained or destroyed by either Japan or potentially treacherous KMT elements. Guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines offered that flexibility.
Mao contrasts the CCP's adaptation with the KMT's approach, doesn't he?
He does. He argues the CCP adapted relatively smoothly, whereas the KMT suffered needless losses, partly due to, in his words, underestimation and morbid fear of Japan. He cites examples like warlords Han Fuchu and Lu Qi, who basically abandoned territory.
So this return to guerrilla warfare wasn't just pragmatic. Mao saw it as having huge significance.
Absolutely. He talks about the historic significance of anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare, noting its extraordinary breadth and protractedness. He calls it unprecedented.
Okay, so let's clarify. Regular warfare is ultimately seen as the decisive factor, the thing that will win the war in the end.
Yes, he maintains that regular warfare is primary in deciding the final outcome.
But guerrilla warfare still holds this extremely important place in strategy. Why is neglecting it such a grave error, according to Mao?
He lists several consequences. If you neglect guerrilla warfare, the enemy can just dig in, consolidate their control over occupied areas easily.
Makes sense.
Your own main forces will suffer heavier losses because they lack support, and the enemy isn't being harassed from behind. It could jeopardize the whole war effort by denying resources and popular support found in those occupied zones.
And it affects the future counteroffensive, too.
Critically, you wouldn't be able to build up the necessary strength behind enemy lines, and the enemy could more easily replace their losses if they aren't constantly being drained by guerrilla actions.
He also adds a condition for success, right?
Yes. He argues that while guerrilla warfare is possible in a large country like China, it can only be victorious when led by the Communist Party, because they provide the political leadership and organization needed to sustain it.
This leads to that idea of a division of labor with the KMT.
Exactly. KMT handles the main fronts with regular warfare. CCP handles the guerrilla warfare behind the lines. He presents this as necessary and proper, a form of mutual need, mutual coordination, and mutual assistance, however tense that relationship actually was.
So this strategic shift back to guerrilla warfare, even though it seemed like a step back, actually brought major advantages for the CCP. Mao lists quite a few.
He does, outlining 18 points in the full text, which is quite detailed. But some key advantages really stand out.
Like shrinking enemy territory and growing their own.
Precisely. Reducing the areas Japan actually controlled and expanding the CCP's own base areas behind enemy lines. Also, coordinating with the main KMT forces, pinning down enemy troops during the defensive phase, helping train troops during the stalemate, and aiding the recovery of territory during the eventual counteroffensive.
And it helped the CCP itself grow.
Massively. It allowed for the rapid expansion of their armed forces and the party organization itself. He talks about aiming for a party branch in every village. It was a way to embed themselves deeply within the population under Japanese occupation.
It sounds like it enabled much more than just military action.
Definitely. It facilitated broad mass movements, establishing anti-Japanese local governments, improving people's livelihood to win support, and even working to demoralize and disintegrate enemy troops through propaganda and political work.
And it fit the reality of the situation. The enemy is strong, we are weak, dynamic.
Perfectly. Guerrilla warfare allowed them to inflict losses while minimizing their own, turning China's vast size into an advantage, making the enemy suffer more, while the CCP preserved and grew its strength. It helped train cadres, solve supply problems.
So the ultimate goal wasn't just to harass Japan, but to transform the CCP through this process.
Yes. The idea was that this vast guerrilla war would eventually evolve, its best elements forming the basis for a powerful regular army, making the CCP a decisive element in the crushing of Japanese imperialism.
This really underscores the need for deep strategic thinking. What does Mao conclude from all this? What's the call to action for the party?
It's an urgent call to study. He stresses the immediate critical need for everyone in the party to seriously study military matters theory, strategy, tactics, political work within the army.
Does he think they were doing okay in some areas?
He acknowledges achievements. He thinks they've learned a lot about tactics, developing new approaches suited to China, and he believes their political work within the army is highly advanced, maybe second only to the Soviet Union's.
But there's a gap.
A big one. He points out the shortcoming is a lack of general summing up, of synthesis. Not enough people were stepping back to analyze the bigger picture.
Specifically strategy and theory.
Yes. He states that only a few people have taken up the study of the problems of strategy and the theory of war, especially at the leadership level. That's the critical gap he wants to fill.
So the task is education.
Widespread military education. He calls the popularization of military knowledge an urgent task for the party and the whole country. And the most important part of that knowledge, the theory of war and strategy.
What's the goal of this push?
To arouse interest in the study of military theory and direct the attention of the whole membership to the study of military matters. It's about embedding this military consciousness, this strategic thinking, throughout the entire organization. Success depended on it.
What a fascinating journey through this text. We've really seen how Mao laid out this argument for why China's revolution had to be armed, how central military power was, with that crucial caveat: the party commands the gun,
and the incredible strategic agility needed to switch between civil war footing and national resistance.
It really is a detailed look at how military strategy, in this view, intertwines completely with political power, building social structures, even cultural change.
Absolutely. And it leaves you thinking, Mao's text isn't just about tactics for winning battles. It's presenting war itself as a tool, maybe the tool in that context, for forging an entirely new society from the ground up, often starting from a position of real weakness.
That connection between force and societal transformation is stark.
It really is. So maybe something to ponder. How might these deep links Mao draws between military means, political ends, and fundamental social reordering, how might they resonate or maybe challenge our thinking in different situations today, even in contexts that thankfully don't involve armed conflict? That adaptability and that provocative idea that all things grow out of the barrel of a gun, it certainly offers a unique, maybe unsettling perspective on how power can be built and used.